The days had grown quieter between them, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but heavy, thick with things left unsaid. She would watch him from the kitchen doorway, her son now towering over her, his shoulders broader, his face sharper, his voice deeper. The little boy who used to cling to her arm now walked past her with his headphones in, lost in a world she no longer understood. He had turned 11 when the change began, subtle at first, like the slow fading of a summer sky. He no longer called her Mama. It was Mom now, flat and distant, like a word borrowed from someone else's home. The warmth of their old bond seemed to stretch thinner with every passing day, until it felt like an invisible wall had risen between them, an invisible gap that she couldn't bridge no matter how close she stood. She remembered the nights when he would crawl into her lap, asking her to tell stories until he fell asleep, the rhythm of her heartbeat calming him. Now, when she knocked on his door, the most she got was a muffled, "Yeah," or a frustrated sigh. He had grown, not just in size, but in distance. The boy she had once carried in her arms now stood taller than her, and yet, she had never felt so far from him. His room was always closed, his phone always in his hand, and his eyes always avoiding hers. There was a time when he told her everything, the fights at school, the dreams he had, the fears that made him hide under the blanket. But now, he had built walls so high that she couldn't even peek over them. Sometimes, she would find him sitting on the edge of his bed, shoulders hunched, his hands clenched into fists. She wanted to ask what was wrong, to hold him like she used to, but something in his expression, something unreadable, something raw, made her stop. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was confusion. The kind that comes when a child begins to feel things too big for words. And she realized, with a sting in her chest, that he was no longer a child. He was becoming someone new, someone she didn't fully know yet. At dinner, she tried to reach out. She talked about her day, about the things they used to laugh at, but his responses were short, distracted. The clinking of his fork against the plate was louder than his words. She looked at his hands, bigger now, rougher, capable, and she thought of how quickly time had taken him from her. Every inch he grew felt like a reminder that she was losing a part of him she could never get back. He was changing faster than she could hold on, and all she could do was watch, quietly breaking behind her calm smile. The 11 inches became more than a number. It was how she measured the distance between who he used to be and who he was now. It wasn't about size or growth. It was about the space that had quietly crept between their hearts, an invisible stretch of silence that she didn't know how to cross. Every time she stood next to him, she noticed it, not just the physical height difference, but the emotional gap. When he spoke, his words carried a tone she didn't recognize, a mixture of independence and guardedness that made her feel like she was intruding on a life she once helped build. That gap was there when she packed his lunch, when he came home late from school, and when she found his sneakers by the door instead of his cheerful voice greeting her. She would stare at him sometimes when he wasn't looking, tracing the outline of his face with her eyes, remembering how it once fit in the palm of her hand. Now that same face was sharper, older, burdened by something she couldn't name. She wanted to ask if he was okay, if school was treating him right, if he still dreamed about building airplanes or exploring space like he once did. But the words would stop at her throat because she could sense the resistance in him, the kind of quiet that told her he didn't want to be asked. That space, that 11-inch divide, wasn't just about growing up, it was about drifting apart. At night, she would find herself sitting by his old photographs, running her fingers over the images. The toothless grin, the scraped knees, the arms always reaching for her. Every picture felt like a piece of something she'd lost but couldn't let go of. She thought of all the times she might have missed, too tired from work, too busy to listen fully, too quick to assume he'd always be there, waiting for her warmth. Now she was the one waiting. Waiting for him to look up, to smile again, to share something real. The silence had become louder than any argument could ever be. One evening, as she was folding his clothes, she noticed a letter tucked inside his drawer. It wasn't addressed to her, but curiosity tugged at her. She opened it carefully, expecting something small, perhaps a note from a friend, but instead, it was a page filled with confusion and frustration. He had written about feeling different, about how hard it was to understand himself, about the pressure of pretending to be okay when he wasn't. Her heart clenched. The distance between them suddenly had a name. It was the weight of everything he couldn't say aloud. She realized he wasn't pushing her away out of anger. He was just lost in the storm of growing up. The 11 inches weren't his fault or hers. It was just the measure of life moving forward, carving space where closeness used to live. She sat on the edge of her bed that night, holding the letter against her chest, feeling its weight like a confession she had never asked for. The words had opened something inside her, an ache that was both love and regret. She had always thought she was protecting him by giving him space, letting him find his own footing. But now she saw how her silence had mirrored his. They had both been waiting for the other to speak first, trapped in a quiet standoff of love unspoken. She wanted to go to his room immediately, to tell him that she understood, that it was okay to be confused, that growing up didn't mean he had to do it alone. But fear held her back, the fear that he would pull away again, that her presence might make his pain heavier instead of lighter. The house was still, the kind of stillness that made every breath sound too loud. She could hear the faint hum of his computer, the soft shuffle of him pacing in his room. She stood in the hallway for a long time, one hand on his door, remembering how many times she used to knock just to say goodnight. It felt like a ritual that had faded away without her noticing. Finally, she knocked softly. There was a pause, then a quiet, "Yeah?" The same tone she had come to expect, but tonight it felt different. When she stepped in, his eyes met hers for just a second before darting away. His face looked tired, the kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep but from carrying too many thoughts at once. She didn't mention the letter. Instead, she sat on the floor beside his desk, looking at the half-finished sketch he was working on. A plane, like the ones he used to draw when he was small. "You still like drawing these," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Yeah," he murmured. "It helps me think." That small response broke something open in her, a door that had been locked for months. She told him she was proud of him, not for being strong, but for being himself, for feeling things deeply even when he couldn't explain them. The air between them softened. He didn't say much after that, but when she stood to leave, he reached out and touched her hand. Just a brief touch, awkward, hesitant, but it was enough to close that invisible gap. The warmth of his fingers lingered long after she left the room. That night, she cried quietly, not from sadness but from relief. The distance between them hadn't disappeared completely, but it had shifted. It was no longer a wall, it was a bridge slowly being rebuilt, one unspoken truth at a time.